Hello, welcome to another spectacular video. I think it's spectacular. And I've got a lovely friend here, Justin. Goes by Jakxshadows on Discord and stuff. I'm pretty sure you've seen him if you hang out in 20 Law, like the rest of us Lorcana gremlins. And he has been my set, my muse, my flame. He's been the reason that I've just had a lot of fun in set six. As he's created this Doc Blue Steel aggro sapphire thing. I know you like to call it Blue Steel Curve, and it's nicknamed is the Kiwi Birds. So we have, which is a complete misunderstanding on a joke said by someone else in our testing group. Um, but yeah, I just really wanted to get him on the channel and just like chat him out, and he can talk you through the amazing way this deck was built because I was in there with the testing as well. And at the start, of course, a lot of our testing group was like, "What are you doing?" And I think even yourself was just losing quite a bit at the start before you got to the point you got to, and we were all like, "What are we
Yeah.
doing here?" But we're both Sapphire Steel, like diehards as well, haven't we? So we just really wanted the color to have a place in the meta in this set. So Justin, please, yeah, introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I've been playing Sapphire Steel since set one. Uh, I jumped on the whole new world ramp train and really enjoyed that all the way through set five. Took that to multiple DLCs, did well with that there, and then just been enjoying Lorcana the entire time that it's existed. So now that we got to this meta game, I was interested in building something new, you know?
Yeah, and I've always quite liked your deck building because I remember even at the time where a few sets ago when Argus was big, and I think you'd like played a store champ, so you'd played an event, and you're like, yeah, I just shoved this 4-1 in my deck because I wanted to beat Sisu and not lose to the Flynn proc. And then it was like, oh, became this hugely meta card that everyone was playing. And you're like, yeah, I might take it out or something. And I was just like, okay, this guy knows how to sort of build decks and play the game. And I think both of us as well, it was like, I saw the Alice card and I really loved that. And of course, everyone went mad with you could ward Tamatoa and stuff. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to be able to make a deck with this, but I know someone who can. And yeah, you just ran away with it. So sort of going into set six, like yeah, you went down this route. I remember you were still trying no wheel and wheel, like we both were, still clinging on to the dream of that deck being really meta viable. But you ended up going down
Oh yeah.
this deck. So yeah, what sort of, how was it started out for you when you started building this? Like, what did you build it as? How did it come together?
Yeah, so the first thing that I noticed when I started in set six, or started thinking about how do we build Sapphire Steel in set six, um, was first of all, the meta got super fast, and it was getting faster in set five, don't get me wrong. We made adjustments in set five with the whole new world versions. If you go back to Seattle, for instance, there I had thrown in two Arthur and a big Simba or two because I knew like back then the meta was so fast, but also had Pete, like very, very prevalent Pete. So we needed like character removal. But at the start of this meta, it was like, okay, it's gotten even faster. And the answers that Sapphire and Steel have are just like not good enough for the threats that existed. And so I looked at the cards that were actually being released in set six for Sapphire and Steel. And like when you look at them, for example, uh, if I pull up here, what do we not need? If I just go over here, right? And we look at like Sapphire Steel cards in set six, and like we just look at like what are the really strong cards, right? Like, and let's just look at legendaries and super rares for a moment. And it's like, okay, if I look at these legendaries and super rares, what
Mm.
has Sapphire and Steel actually gained, right? Like, okay, Oswald is cool, but he's super slow. And for the meta game that we ended up in, I knew immediately that Oswald was not going to be fast enough. And Alice was interesting to me, obviously, but we'll come back to that. Captain Amelia, I looked at, I was like, okay, Inkable, like kind of a weird card, right? 1/4 is not a great stat line without ward. Baymax, again, kind of an interesting card, like gaining lore. Uh, like instant lore gain is pretty rare in Sapphire Steel, so that stood out to me. Jafar, another uninkable, right? Wreck-It Ralph and Uninkable, Mr. Smee even. Like if this card were an inkable card as a shift line, maybe this sees play. But again, that 3 strength. Tadashi, like I know a lot of people were excited about Tadashi at the start of the set, and he was just this essentially just this big dumb dude that doesn't do anything on play. Which again, for how fast the metagame was, I was like, that's not going to work. So like the one card that really stood out to me amongst the super rares and legendaries for Sapphire and Steel was Alice. And then if we back that down and we say, okay, what about the rares that came out, right? It's like, all right, we got Calhoun. We've got Gontu. Like, okay, these are cards that are quite interesting. These are cards that look to be very strong to me, but not in the traditional version of Sapphire Steel that we've got, right?
Mm.
Um, and so when I saw all this stuff coming out, I was like, okay, I don't think Ramp Blue Steel or Sapphire Steel is where we want to be. And then at the end of Seattle, Bad Vegas and I have been goofing around. We were like, what if we built a deck that had Kick Cloud Kicker? What if we built a deck that had Sisu Water Dragon and Pete's and Smee's and Cogsworth and we shifted Kit and we did all these fun things with it, right? And so that's where I sort of started. I was like, all right, very first iteration of the deck that I thought about for this set was what if I focus in on shift lines with Robin Hood and Kit? I got my shifters there. I know I like Cogsworth. That's one of my favorite cards. I know Alice was looking to be very strong. I thought Gaunt 2 was going to be very interesting. It turns out we like Gaunt 2 quite a bit. And then I was also a bit worried with how fast the metagame was. I was like, okay, well, maybe all of this isn't going to be quite fast enough. So what if we also throw in like a Tinkerbell shift line? Um,
Mm.
and from there, the deck sort of started to form up, right? Like I said, okay, I've got Alice. What can I do with Alice that's interesting? Well, I can play this Sisu Water Dragon, which is also again one of my favorite cards, even though she's really not playable
Mm.
as we found out. We can give Ward to Chen Po. You'll see one of the cards that's missing here, right? If we look at our 4 costs, there's no Pluto in this initial list I made. There's also no Baymax in this initial list I made. So like that sort of package didn't come until a little bit later.
Mm. I do remember as well at the time, like, I don't know where you're at with the deck, but there was other people trying to do versions and they had like 2 Pluto in it or something, but they didn't go fully in on it. And then I remember
Mm-hmm.
myself as well. I tried to do the split of you could play, you know, standard Quill ramp, or you could play the Alice, but it felt very much like if you were splitting the deck 2 ways, there would be games where you didn't know which option was even better. Like, do I play the Alice
Yeah,
on free or do I play the Quill? So it was like there was clearly something there, but like we needed someone to put all the pieces together.
yeah. All right. So as we move forward, speaking of putting the pieces together, right? We said, okay, what about having Pluto? So we found Pluto, and we're like, all right, turns out this Alice and Pluto combo is pretty good. And we were experimenting with like how many 1 drops do we need. Um, I in this version, it turns out I had Doc and Happy, didn't connect the dots with this version and put in the mine. Instead, no, instead this version was actually very aggressive.
Oh
I tried
wow.
out Hiram
I don't
Flaversham's in
even
it.
remember this. Yeah.
This version did not last for long, I don't think. It turns out Hiram Flaversham as a Piglet replacement is just not good enough.
Hmm.
Oh man, Piglet is such a strong card. Like if we could have half the cards that Amber Steel aggressive decks have, we'd be so powerful.
Hmm.
But you do start to see some of the things coming together here, right? So we've got the Alice, the Pluto, you've got the Baymax showing up as a one of. You've got the Beast starting to show up, which I think you and I both sort of waver on like how good is Beast, right?
Yeah, he's
Um,
a card that a lot of people when they said they want to build the deck, I'm like, you really don't need Beast. Like to be honest with you, it could be any 5 drop that's a fairly good body in quests, and Yeah, Zeus is
Yeah.
still pretty common with all the genies and the sharks around. So yeah, 4X would feel quite overwhelming right now to play, I think.
And then in this version we had Wreck-It Ralph. This was the version where I learned a few things, right? One, Piglet's a strong card and Hiram Falversham as a 2-drop is not. And two, we really want to be careful going above 6 ink or going
Mm,
above 5 ink rather, especially when that 6 ink card is uninkable.
mm.
This card seems like it could be really good. It's not quite what we want from it. The other big addition that you'll see going from that very first edition to this one is we get into McDuck Manor range, right? And so I believe at some point in time between the first version and this version, I was having a conversation with you and Bad Vegas, and it was just like, guys, I think the deck has something to it, but I don't know how to beat Red Blue.
Mm.
And part of that was part of trying to beat Red Blue was putting in this Hiram Faversham, putting in this Wreck-It Ralph, putting in this Manor, and seeing what was good into it and what was not.
And
Also, Winnie the Pooh, shout out to my boy.
I yeah, yeah, we got to talk about Winnie the Pooh as well. I remember as well, Wreck-It Ralph, like me and Bad Vegas were quite excited to use the card. I was probably the least excited, but we had just we had just came off like Castle pretty much dominating Queen's Castle, like
Oh
dominating
yes.
matchups, and like purple locations were just so strong, and so was McDuck Manor that we were like we just want to be able to answer it. But then we got into this set 6 meta where it was like, well, we've got so much rush and like crabs being 4x in lists, so people were just like, I'm not gonna play manas anymore. Not gonna play Queen's Castles either. So it was like, oh, now Wreck-It Ralph didn't really have much to hit either. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and as you say, all the other negatives as well. It's like 6 cost. You don't have any items to banish as well if you need to banish
Right.
like your own stuff. So yeah, interesting card, but
Yeah. The other line that we were experimenting with in this particular version was the Winnie the Pooh to Chenpo, very like mimicking kind of what Steel Fossa does, and that was fun. That's certainly a line that if someone wanted to build that into a curve deck like this, I wouldn't bat an eye seeing that.
yeah.
I think that's very strong.
It's something to note for a little treat if anyone's watching this. This far in is Winnie the Pooh. We found is probably really one of the best cards to tech in for the mirror.
Yes.
Just being able to on the draw, even on the play, jump to Cogsworth a turn earlier means you can trade with your 1 and 2s and everything, and then when he's actually got resist as well, and just getting Cogsworth down earlier is like a way to do better in the mirror. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a little tip for anyone.
Yeah. The weird thing about this version was I had taken out Calhoun's, right?
Oh, for
There's
the
some cards
Hiram,
that are missing in this version, yeah.
I wonder which
So
rare what is worth more money now in the set. Yeah.
All right. Moving on, we jump up a couple more versions and we start to see it sort of coalescing into, I think, something very close, though not quite, what you took
Mm.
to
We're still
Continentals in
experimenting with the
Europe.
bow here, but I believe
Yeah.
around the time I went to Continentals, we were like pretty on the fence about the bow. Like I had
Yeah.
them sleeved up. Yeah.
Yeah. We were a little bit convinced for a little while. A lot of people in the Sapphire Steel community, even for the ramp builds, were like, we want to play Imperial Bow to deal with Genie. And it turns out it's fine. It's really not what this deck wants to be doing. It's
Mm.
it's such a dead draw sometimes, you know. Um
And there was that very much like shoehorn deck building of like I'm a victim of it. Like I remember seeing everyone in Sapphire Steel was like, if you play a bow and a Calhoun, you can take out a genie for a really good trade. It's like you can, but then
you
the
can't.
rest of the time the bow is awful top deck. It's really it costs 3 ink. You know, it costs that 1 ink to like play every turn as well. And as
Yep.
you say, you'd rather just be playing a character or like anything else
Right.
to pressure the win. So
Yep.
it just yeah.
What else is notable here? So
The
we tested
Mickeys as
out
well
on
have
a
now appeared.
the Mickeys. All right, so now we're getting into so the 1-drops here have now solidified. And I don't think, except for minor versions that get tested every so often, the Mickey and the Robin Hoods never leave the deck again at this point in time. So you can see this was updated on the 26th of November. The Anas were here. We were testing that as like we need more two drops, and
Mm.
unfortunately the issue is like all the other two drops just weren't quite good enough. You can see like we tested Lawrence again, another card that if someone wanted to put Lawrence in this deck, I wouldn't bat an eye at them doing so.
Yeah.
We got the Pete's back into the deck, right? Like I think that was another one of the cards that um, sort of you know what you're getting from Pete. So when you are, I guess, as a deck building sort of tip, when you're testing a whole bunch of things, right? And you're before you're trying to land on like what am I going to use for an actual tournament, uh, Pete's the sort of card that if you wanted to, you could take him out briefly
Mm.
to make more space for other cards that you're testing, right? And so I think in these earlier versions of what we had been looking at, that's one of the things that happened was that Pete got cut just for spaces to test things.
That's a good. That's a
Um,
very interesting point. Yeah.
yeah, it's another. So I guess another thing I'll point out. So Chen Po is in this previous version, and when we get to my Continentals list, you'll see Chen Po makes it back into the list. But in like any of these intermediate lists, which I don't know if we'll go through all of them or not, but Chen Po's missing from all of those lists, and it's
Mm.
because again I know exactly what I get from Chen Po. I know how good he is. I know exactly when I want to use him, everything like that. So, uh, from the point of view of like, is he integral to the game plan? No, not necessarily, but he's very, very solid when you want him. And if you already know exactly what he offers, why not use that spot, right?
Mm.
Um, Here we see the introduction of the Scrooges.
Which
So,
still fluctuates when we brick. You know, he can still
oh
fall
yeah,
out of
oh
favor
yeah.
with us. Yeah.
Oh man, I still will delete him from the deck every so often.
Mm.
I think that's the main stuff to talk about here
And it's
as we continue on.
interesting note,
Go
but you
ahead.
say about the Annas and the two drops because I get this a lot with the deck. It's like I wish I had more two drops because I don't miss two, or I miss I had more one drops so I don't miss one. But we've done that thing of
Yeah.
you add more two drops in or you add more one drops in, and they're just not as good as what these two can do. I'm gonna focus on the two drops that are like Smee and Calhoun are just the best two drops you can get. So it's like
Yeah.
adding Anna or Mr. Arrow if he appears in any of these. It's like okay, you've got a two drop, but like yeah, Mr. Arrow, you've got a two drop, but like do you really want that two drop? I'm not saying it's better than missing two drop slot, but it's like you're not going to win the game because you put Mr. Arrow Anna down on two. So yeah, that was kind of worked in my head at least. And I even went crazy down to like seven two drops at one point just because I wanted the
Yeah.
unink space.
Right.
Yeah,
All right. So now, going from the previous version to this one, really, I think we're messing around with Scrooge numbers. We start to focus in like, okay, this is just about what you end up taking to
yeah. I
Continentals.
think this with
We,
some Philo fills in there as well. But
yeah,
this is pretty much the list. Yeah.
yeah. So we saw Wendy Darling as a ward character, and early on in the set, when Shark wasn't quite as prevalent, it turned out that throwing down a three power or three strength warded character that quested for two, all of those things are very good against red blue. They essentially force red blue to be prepped because they don't play things like Lady Tremaine very often.
Mm.
And so we looked at this card and we were like, all right, we want to guarantee some lore because sometimes we get to 18 and we just want to throw down a warded character. And Cogsworth and Alice are nice, don't get me wrong, but they died a big Sisu, right?
Mm.
And so Windy Darling satisfied that sort of issue that we were having. The Gontus are up to four. Like this is sort of as teched as we could get it. Almost we could put in more Scrooges. I think as you ended up doing
Mm.
for Continentals for the red blue matchup, right? So we've got the Gontus, we've got four Manners, we've got four Windies. Like this is a very good version into red blue. So
Yeah, and I think it's a good point of like, so as you say, people will be prepared to Wendy Darling if you get to like 18 law and you put her on
mhm.
board. And I think it's a really good point to make about these sort of like aggressive early curve and aggro lists is like So when we play Alice and we ward it with a Pluto, we know the Pluto will be banished at some point, but what we're trying to do is make it very much in our favor that they did that. And you'd have those
Yeah.
Steel Song matchups where they've got to run all their singers into it, or a Fox Bounce won't remove it because it's got 5 health, so they're going to have to work a little bit harder, and they can't run the thing in that they're going to bounce with, and it's a lot of the time, Wendy Darling's a really good example of that. It's like, yeah, they'll get rid of it, but they've had a 7 cost action that's a board wipe to get rid of a Wendy Darling, which I'll admit happened a lot when I played her.
Yeah.
So it's trying to get those sort of valuable exchanges in the game quite a lot of the time.
Yep.
Hmm.
All right. And then here, uh, this might be your Continentals list, actually. I
Uh,
believe.
if there's fill in there, it might
Oh,
be.
we were missing the two fills that were
Yes,
in
yeah.
here. So very close. I don't know if I actually have a fill list.
I think
I
I
was
might have went
not.
off off record with the fill choice. Yeah. I wanted,
So,
and I wasn't even using it to buff the Calhoun to take out daisies. I was playing it because I wanted to top deck 1 drops that are heroes and
uh-huh.
get the lore, and that never once
Yep.
happened in my experience with Phil.
No, Phil was not as good as we wanted him to be,
No.
is what it came down to. I think the main thing here is the twin fire,
Mm.
right?
Which
Uh,
I've explained to people. I thought it was good at the time. You had a lot of like Merfolk Banzo opens or like Cindy Piglet opens, but now it just doesn't
hmm
feel like I see that as much. Like,
Yeah.
so it just feeling like the card was getting removed. Fire the Cannons is probably the best, but then we were like, we kind of want uninks. We want like the unink space, and we want to be able to ink this
hmm
terrible removal into Ruby Sapphire. So it was like, well, Baboom sort of fills that job, and like I'm only really taking out like Robin Hood shift lines or like a Diablo if I have to. But
Yep.
yeah.
So that was the big one there. Let's see. Okay. All right,
Oh, this
folks.
is where it's getting
Let's
crazy. Yeah.
talk about this. Let's talk about this.
No one would have
Okay.
known 4, doesn't it? I have a playset of foils
Uh,
of these, uh, just for if it ever comes back. But please do tell us about this
so
card.
there's a funny story. I was playing some games one day, and we get into, or I finish a match, and I'm looking at 20 lore, and I'm in the Sapphire Steel thread, right? And someone just posts like, "Hey, good game, whoever was just playing Sapphire Steel aggro with 4 dozen eggs." And I'm just quietly like, "Oh no, please don't post about the deck. Please don't post about the deck." Um, okay, so 4 dozen eggs. Why did 4 dozen eggs come about? There's a whole bunch of actually very interesting things about this version of the deck to
Yeah.
talk about. Uh, so 4 dozen eggs came about in this version as a way to, like, if you stall the board, which can happen quite frequently with this deck. If you're uncomfortable with how to play the deck, and like even to this point, right? I was 8 separate versions into the deck. I was still uncomfortable enough with it that I was getting into these like really weird board states that were just sort of stalled out, especially against purple decks. As people will notice when you're playing against the Amethyst decks, if they throw down a bunch of 1 drops and they start threatening crabs and foxes, it can become very awkward of like, do I give them a trade?
Mm.
And so that's where 4 dozen eggs came in. I was like, what if I just build really wide against like blurple, purple steel, green purple, like all of these ones, right? Um, just build a really wide board, throw down my Alice, get my Pluto down, give my Pluto some songs to sing, right? And then quest out over a couple of turns. And I had seen people like Boomy Jr., for example, and DeCandio were using the Kita, the
Mm.
big Kita, and doing stuff like that. And I was like, how do we mimic that sort of thing using Sapphire Steel cards? And the answer there is like, okay, we get Cogsworth, we get 4 dozen eggs, and where we essentially accomplish that sort of thing. But even better, right? We can use Cogsworth and 4 dozen eggs to make favorable trades instead of just -3 strength to every character. So that's where that sort of came into play.
Mm.
And so along with adding in some 4 cost songs, which we had wanted along came Zeus, um, we also threw in this Jafar Dreadnought.
Yeah.
Uh,
I do remember
and
the Jafar Dreadnought because I came back from Continentals and I was quite excited, and I said I just need the deck to brick a bit less and I need to draw a little bit more. And I was like, well, we'll
uh-huh.
swap the Scrooges out for Jafar because he kind of draws you a card, and he's a decent body for a 4 drop. But the thing is, he doesn't quest for two, and like
Yeah,
people who are giving you Jafar draw, you know, it's the same as people give you like Rapunzel draw. It's like it just doesn't happen at a certain level of play, does it? So
yeah,
he was in for 2 days, I think, for me. Yeah.
yeah. There's some interesting things. So like if you talk to other players in like Emerald decks with Calhoun or Amber decks with Calhoun, right? If you play those sort of aggressive decks, one of the things you'll notice is that they have like those one drops, right? Like Cinderella 1, Robin Hood 1, Curse Merfolk, all those sorts of things that sort of deserve answers or demand answers very quickly. And like we've got Robin Hood 1 and you can sort of bait it if you want to with Robin Hood 1,
Mm,
but it's less effective in our deck. Um, but so like going a high value one drop that people want to trade into, and then into Calhoun, we were like, okay, what if we could do the same thing with Jafar and give like quest with Alice, give something ward, play this Jafar, and like give them that sort of bait. And it
mm.
wasn't bad, it was doable,
I
but it
mean,
was
you could
like I
still
actually
use it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But like at the end of the day, we didn't want our Alice to die. We want our Alice to live.
Yeah. And I think what else is also interesting is the Along Came Zeus because I feel every Steel player at some point is like, just throw Along Came Zeus in the list because you know it's 4 ink when you can sing it and it does 5 damage. So like most high value like targets are removed. Like the genie and the shark were the two big ones this set, and they both got removed
Yeah.
from this card. And I feel like every Steel player has that moment where they're just like, I just don't want it on the board anymore. It annoys me. So just put this card in the list. And then eventually you learn the meta a bit more, learn how to play around it, and it comes out of the list again.
Yeah. And it was interesting, right? Like when we had Along Came Zeus in the deck, into red blue, I don't know about you, but I ended up in these weird scenarios where I would have to do some like weird inking. Notice this is a 16 uninkable list, right?
Mm.
I'd do some weird inking early game. This Zeus would just be clogging up my hand.
Yes.
But then all of a sudden they would play a shark on 6 ink. I'd Zeus it and quest out, and all of a sudden I would just win the game because they were so dependent on having that shark do something. I
Yeah.
do miss that sometimes, but it just made the game so awkward.
Yeah, like you say, it clogs up the hand, and if they were to just skip the shark and go to B prep and C2, you'd sort of. But I know what you mean. It was sometimes like, I don't like that on the board, just get rid of it.
Yeah.
But I feel like as the sets go on, people get smarter and wiser to these things.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So, all right. Now, before we get to the next deck list, no, this was the 8th of December. This was right around when you were at Continentals, right? And like you were messaging me like, I want to get rid of the Scrooge. I want to get rid of and get some more draw, get Zeus in the deck. And I was like, okay, cool.
I
Well, that
also
weekend
remember
was
one of the messages I sent you was, "We're dropping Phil from this, or I'm dropping it. I've only ever inked him, and I'm
I've
on, you
only
know,
ever inked him.
I've played for 2 days and I've only ever inked this card."
Uh-huh. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
I can't even find a list in my dream board that had
I think I was off the record for that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I tested him with you a little bit, but I just like was not impressed with him.
Mm.
So, yeah, so during that weekend while you were gone, I had up to that point in time, I had an amazing win rate with the deck. Was just like was absolutely smashing it in testing, right? And then that weekend while you were gone, I really struggled with it in testing, and I was like I need to take a break. And so I played aggressive Amber Steel for a couple days and I took some lessons I learned from aggressive Amber Steel with Whole New World. Shout out to Boomy again for that style deck. And I was like, well, what if we built a curve BS list that just wants to shift, right? And so I threw in the Mickey the Robin Hood, and I was like, what other shift lines do I have? Well, I've got this Cogsworth that turns out is a Floodborn. You kind of ignore that most of the time. But what if we put in a couple of him to shift on? And what if we put in the Mickey Mouse Playful Sorcerer, right? That's shift line. And if I'm already on that and I'm thinking about playing a whole new world, I want to be able to hand dump really well. So I'm going to throw in some more 2 drops even. So I'm going to throw in these magic brooms. This list was absolutely fascinating to me. Um, there's some very cool things you can do with this sort of list, like shifting Cogsworth on turn 3 and then singing a whole new world on 4 and hand dumping is very interesting. Uh, also, and I think you and I have both talked about this. People have asked us about like budget builds.
Hmm.
Certainly, Mickey Mouse, the shift line here, the broom line, that's actually quite strong.
Yeah.
If you wanted to tech the deck just specifically for amethysts, I could definitely see someone justifying going the Mickey shift line and putting in brooms.
Yeah. I
Um,
I remember as well at this time, like I think I was playing a little bit less because I just got back from Continentals and I wanted a little break. And I saw you testing this and I was like getting the play sets of all the cards. I didn't like 4 dozen eggs and like the 2 drop Cogsworth because I just for some reason didn't have them. And I was like, locals were like, yeah, you can have them. Don't really know why, um, but you can have the
no.
cards. And I remember seeing you, and
Uh,
I think like you had this assumption, or I think the evidence proved that it was like into some of the Ruby matchups, just being able to go over them the same way that Wheeling always has for Ruby matchups. You could just win off
uh-huh.
those value,
Oh
and then I
yeah.
guess into other lower to the ground decks, it's like a lot of decks in the meta right now pray that you wheel them. Like
Yeah.
they're very happy
Yeah.
if you do.
Yeah. So this version actually was very polarizing in comparison to the other versions, which is a great point. So Whole New World is pretty good into red purple, right? It's pretty good into red blue actually. Like a lot of people will say it's not, but it turns out like if you play it well and you sing a Whole New World and then you just hand dump with a Pete, that's pretty good into red blue. Uh, Same thing with the purple decks, right? Whole New World's going to negate a lot of purple decks' card advantage, especially when they don't see it coming, right? Because like this deck is very bizarre. People weren't expecting a whole new world in it, so it made those matchups actually a bit stronger, and then it made the like Amber Steel aggressive matchups worse. Like, oh man, it made the aggressive purple steel matchup abysmal.
Yeah, I can imagine so.
All right, so moving on from that, we get back into the regular curve, though this one I was still shifting and I was still on Whole New World. So I took a little break from Doc because I took those lessons I learned here. I found it very interesting. The Cogsworth line was like cool, but like not quite it. And I went back to more of the like tried and true cards that we were pretty happy with, but still taking some lessons from that whole new world version. And if I was gonna like pick back up a whole new world version, it would probably start with something like this, though the actions here would probably all change quite a bit based off the things that we've learned since then. Um, and yeah, like I think this is a perfectly legitimate deck. As I was saying before, I think it's a much more polarizing version, which I think for a lot of competitive players is not quite where you want to be, right? You don't want
Yeah.
to like walk into a matchup
And no,
and
you're
just
probably not going to win
lose.
it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
I did say as well during the store champs thing, as this list's kind of been out there now, there were some people who went for a more whole new world based version, and they did report like good results. Like I think they might have won their store champs, which is like cool. But as you say, there was probably the instance where they got the matchups they required on the day, and the deck ran
hmm
smoothly. And yeah, I think if you really want to increase your like Ruby Sapphire matchup where you can just wheel and go over them, probably is decent there. But then into the field of all the other aggro decks that you do play into at these local tournaments, you're just not going to do that well.
yeah.
Mm.
I will say it also makes the Emerald matchups a lot worse, right?
Yes,
Um,
yeah,
so that's something to keep an eye on because with these whole New World versions, the idea behind them was you mulligan for a shift line, but you're not playing Amber Steel, so you don't have a way to search for a whole new world with Ariel, right? And so what you would do instead is you would when you're mulliganing, you would mulligan for a shift line and you would keep a single whole new world. And so those emerald decks would hit with their Ursula, which is normally dead, um, into this style of deck, and then you're out of card draw, right? So like it would become it was very awkward in that regard.
Mm.
Okay. All right. 17 on inks. How
Oh
often do you
wow,
think I
yeah,
brick this?
that is rough. Yeah,
Okay, but I want to hit on this one just
that
briefly. Three
action
Scrooges is
removal.
oh yeah.
We're covered for.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't realize all the songs as well. That's so much
Yeah.
removal.
There we go. Yeah, we got a lot of removal in this
Yeah.
one. So this is too much removal, right? So one of the lessons that people should sort of take away from this video is like when we're building a deck, right? What are we doing? Like what sort of game plan do we end up on? And this version was not quite there with understanding what the game plan of the deck actually needed to be. It became a little bit too unfocused, and part of that is like I had three uninkable removals. I had a fourth uninkable song down here for a removal, and then I had the strength. So I was running six removals at the time, which is like not terribly, terribly high, but I also had the two 4 dozen eggs, and four of my removals were uninkable, right? So if my hand was sort of bricked with removal, I didn't have the option very much other than the strengths to just ink those and play the few characters I did have. I really like in this style of deck, no fishbone quill, right? So we have to play our uninkables at some point in time. And so I sort of got forced into that. So that's one of the, I would say from this version, that was the lesson that I sort of started to learn was be aware of the number of like uninkable cards in the deck that don't fit the game plan, right?
Mm.
Scrooge, fine. I don't know that I would ever run three Scrooges again, but like he fits the game plan. Alice is the game plan, like literally, right? Doc's the game plan. Calhoun fits the game plan. So like those sorts of things weren't going anywhere. But
Mm.
man, four uninkable removals. You run into a red blue with a hand like that, and you're just
Oh,
cooked.
yeah, in Thailand, that was something I really learnt with Twin Fire of like, if you get one in the mulligan, it's like you're gonna have a Twin Fire to the end of the game because it's
Oh
like
yeah.
it's gonna be rare you have a target for it. And I'll
Yeah.
say as well when we test when we were testing quite heavily for this deck, like a common thing that would be said is what are we doing here? And it would be like I got 4 dozen eggs in my list. What are we doing here? You know what's
What
going
are
on?
we doing here?
Yeah.
And then 2 turns later, we'd either top deck another 4 dozen eggs, or
Oh,
we would sing it with Pluto. And either we would feel terrible top decking a second one that's useless, or we would feel like absolute gods amongst players
yeah.
for the.
And this is also something like so this list has 49 characters, and you can kind of put the McDonald manners in as characters, I guess, because a lot of the time the deck will force you into top deck mode, and you can lose
Mhm.
because the next card you top decked was a Fire the Cannons or a Strength of the Raging Fire, and I kind of like to keep it around 50, 51 list card like characters just so I'm top decking any character.
Mhm.
Yeah, just to try keep it because Doc is great card draw, but if you don't win after the Doc card draw, you're kind of back into top deck mode, and you need to just keep
Yeah.
having gas.
Yep. All right. Let's see here. Do I even want to go over this one? There's really not much here to talk about.
Shield of Ard, I
I
think
mean,
that was a day worth of. I can
yeah.
remember it messaged me about it. Yeah.
So these two cards are interesting. I would not play either of them. If you really want to tech against red blue, you could play Donald Duck.
Mm.
Don't play Shield of Arendelle. Okay, and now we start getting into what I'm gonna call it modern, even though the time
Modern.
span of this deck is really just this set, you know.
Yeah.
So this is where we're ending up. Almost like this isn't quite what I took to Continentals for the LCQ, but this is a very solid list. You'll notice in this particular list, I was maneuvering around uninkable counts. I think one thing that I learned is I would either do 4 Alice and 3 Calhoun, or I would just do the 12 uninkables. Um, any more than 12 uninkables in this deck really starts to feel very clogged up.
Mm.
Uh, at least that's always been my opinion. You can certainly go to like 13 or 14. I know you like the Scrooge, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, every time we've talked about, I like Scrooge. Sometimes even on turn five, like if I've missed ink to get to five, playing Scrooge feels like it's like value enough. You know, this deck
yeah.
doesn't do much else besides put bodies on the board, and you're putting a 5/5. And we've also mentioned I was really hoping Ben would appear in one of these lists because
Oh,
just every so often I would just hear you go, we really should try Ben because it's like Scrooge, a little bit worse, and it's inkable. And it was just like,
oh
no,
no.
I can't go from the joy and the height of playing Scrooge McDuck, this 5/5 beast on turn four, to then. But I think what happened more with that card was that you found the support buff that it has isn't the worst thing in the world. Like you could buff the one drops up like Calhoun, and then you could do like some like buff Calhoun, take out Hiram. You know, you could do some really cool stuff with it. But
Yeah,
I was just never really sold on the card.
yeah. So I did have a version. I don't know where it went. With Ben in it actually, and I played some locals with him, and I actually didn't mind Ben as a Scrooge replacement. Um, you know, 4/3 quests for two with support. Like you were saying, it's a solid card. It's a playable card
Hmm.
for sure. Uh,
I think
but
as well on
it's
that latest list, you've gone up to four docks, which I'll admit in like big competitive events, I've been on three docks the entire time because I've just said
Mhm.
play your lineup, mulligan well, and then like if you draw a dock, that's just a little bit more to the engine. But
Yeah.
at this point, I've just 4x dock and just said like if Amber Steel is doing it, I have to do it as well. Um, and then you get into these lovely cool play patterns of like on 4 ink dock and a Calhoun, or like five
Yep.
Alice and a dock, and then like you learn these little very simplest lines of just make it equal the amount of ink you've got. But
Yeah.
it's really cool. I mean, I love getting like ink, play the dock, get a McDuck mana and play that on like 6 ink. You know, stuff like that is
Uh-huh.
just really fun to do.
Right. Yeah. Let's see what else. So the version 618 was, you can see, this is where we maxed out John Silver. Um, John Silver's a card that it took us a while to see that it was going
Yeah.
to be a really good card, right? And I think it really didn't see play back at like the EU Continentals, for example. Um,
No.
but once we got, go ahead.
Yeah. I was gonna say it really was a card that's like if I could go back to that run, I would generally wish I had this card around because
Yeah.
I think it really brings the deck together. I mean, even today I did a store champ, so I'm going to timestamp this video. Where it's able to play it on like Tinkerbells, you know, and that just gives you another like a 6 cost Tinkerbell, another turn of full quest. They have an answer on
Yep.
their board, but you only need to quest for one more turn, don't you, or something? And
Right.
that's just what this card can allow. Stop a Maui Shark from doing its thing as well.
Yep. So I've really loved the curve of like one drop Mr. Smee John Silver.
Mm.
Um, I think people look at this card and they sort of are like, one of the comments that we've gotten a whole bunch, right, is Justin, you've got all these one questers now. You've got John
Mm.
Silver, you've got Pete, you've got Pluto, you've got Calhoun, you've got Mickey, you've got Robin Hood, you got Doc, like all these things that quest for one, right? And it's not wrong. A lot of this deck actually is utility cards,
Yeah.
which is very interesting for a deck that wants to be more aggressive. It has a lot of utility in it. uh but like the ability to stop a Lawrence from challenging in the Amber Steel matchup, like John Silver is, I would say, key to the Amber Steel matchup sometimes,
Mm.
because you need to be able to take a trade that presents itself, because they're trying to trap you so that they can whack their John or their Lawrence in and then Rapunzel heal, right? Well, if all of a sudden they present you trade that is favorable for you except for the Lawrence, and then you have the John Silver, you've just flipped that entire play on its head and taken the tempo back entirely.
Mm.
Um,
And you
so
set up that
he's,
singer for strength as well, and
oh
yeah,
yeah,
uh, it's just and um, yeah, just loads of good things about John Silver. I really wish I'd have played him earlier and would have sort of cracked that code. As the Wendy
Yep.
Darlings came out for John Silver there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think credit where credit's due, right? The John Silver was actually one of your locals that suggested it to you, and you brought it up to me, and I was like, let's give it a shot.
Oh wow, he
Um,
is gonna get super hyped to hear that. Yeah, I think he played it against me once, and I was like, I think, and then I saw it in, it was a Candio's list or something, and we were just trying it out, and it was like, yeah, you just get that another turn of full questing. And another good thing about the
mm,
deck you made, like the reason why this deck I think has a lot of utility cards, and the way you worded it, I think it's worded it very well, is with Amber Steel, they have like Daisy, which is this insane quester for 1 ink, and they can spam them on the board. They can play all of them. They can dock, refill, and play more. We don't have many big questers. Alice is probably the best quester in our deck. So we have to get a lot more value out of our cards than others' decks do. So we have to
yeah,
play Alice to ward things up, and we have to play the bodyguards, and we have to play Cogsworth because we're trying to get more value out of that Smee than Amber Steel is. Like Amber Steel will just turn it sideways and it gets removed. They're like, cool, I'll play a Lawrence and 2 daisies. We're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
we need to get this Smee to do 4 law or 6 law before it will be
Hmm.
removed because we know we're a curve and we're quite an aggressive deck. Our 2 drop won't last the game, but we need to get that extra value out of it, and that's kind of what the deck tries to do every turn. It's like, well, we just need to ward up this bodyguard so we get like this Pluto, so we just get another turn less of trading, and then everything has resist, so their steel removal is a little bit worse, and that's what we're trying to
Yeah,
do every single um, game, really, isn't it? We're trying to get as much value out of the cards we have rather than Amber Steel, which just like flood the board, or these like purple decks as well, where they're just like flood cantrip 1 drops that replace themselves, because we can't do that. We can't just put
right.
a bunch of Diablos and crab buff for another card draw. We have to be like, no, this Mickey has to get X amount of lore. You know?
Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've actually really enjoyed playing the deck is that when we play this style deck with Sapphire Steel, it really encourages very strong fundamentals of trading card games,
Hmm.
right? We need to take the value trades when we see them in the right time at the right place. We need to make sure each like we're getting, we're sort of squeezing all the life we can from each of the cards that we play. We don't have the luxury of a bunch of card draw. We don't have the luxury of a catch up mechanic or um, you know, bounce mechanics and stuff like that. So like all of those really strong things that are in the game that I don't fault anyone for playing those things. Those are all strong things.
Hmm.
But the deck just doesn't have that, right? And so what we're banking on is like we're going to use Alice, we're going to use well-statted characters like the Smee, the Calhoun, the Pluto, the
And
Robin Hood shift, right?
as you say, you can see those sort of lower static characters like Mr. Arrow and Anna, and like the Hiram that you
Yeah.
had way back the O2, because we need not our characters just to gain us lore. They also have to be decent bodies on the board for trading.
Yeah,
Like we don't mind that you run the fox in as long as the fox is removed as well. We want stuff like that to happen every game, don't we? As you
exactly.
say, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that Alice is like the one card along with maybe the Mickey where we've looked at it and we're like these two cards are worth playing despite the lack of board presence that
Hmm.
they provide.
Yeah, and the
Everything
Mickey
else.
in this like 1 drop quite heavy meta, he does all right. You
Yeah,
know, the Merfolks,
yeah, yeah.
the Diablos, everything like that, he takes them out.
Yep.
And it's just that it's very hard for an aggro player to be like there is complexity to this deck, or like not an aggro, but you know what I mean, these fast decks and these dock builds.
Yeah.
It's very hard for us to. It's very complex and stuff like that because I guess it's not billions of ramp decisions. But yeah, there is things like I will quest with a Smee when they have a readied snake on board, and people go, "Why will you do that?" It's because, well, I want to when the Pluto comes down. I want them to not have that good a trade into the Pluto because they just crab buff run it in, and there was no point me playing the Pluto and warding it up.
Yeah.
And it's those sort of decisions you have to make, and it's kind of just knowing the fundamentals of card games, value, and exchange and stuff like that. It's like I got 2 lore, I got rid of their snake, and now the Alice Pluto lock will be a lot stronger, and it's just knowing
Yeah.
those sort of decisions that really can get you far with this deck, I think.
Oh, for sure. All right, and then we end up at version 620 Timberdoodle. This is the version that I took to the LCQ that I went to, and unfortunately, I didn't have the success with it that I wanted. But despite that, I felt that the overall list that I had here, with some very interesting tech choices, was quite strong. Um, so one of the things, let's see, where is it? The Ling. So
Mm.
this was a tech card that I think was in a very good spot, um, in particular that weekend, where I was expecting a lot of aggressive Amber Steel to show up. And I knew that if I curved out, like, for example, Mickey Mouse Calhoun Ling, that was a very good response to someone that goes Daisy Duck, Mr. Smee Lawrence. So if you trade in the Mickey Mouse into the Smee, you take the Daisy with the Calhoun. Maybe they're expecting that they're going to be able to run that Lawrence into the Calhoun afterwards, and get a nice favorable trade that they can then Rapunzel. But all of a sudden, what they're left with is nothing but a Lawrence on the board staring down an exerted Calhoun with 4 strength.
Mm.
And so that gave me some very interesting stuff there. So like, would I always play Ling? No, I would. He's an interesting card. He's not quite good enough. Just generally speaking, he's an example of a card that I think is a very strong tech choice at the right time.
Mm. Yeah, I quite like the Ling. I didn't realize as well that you could do things like Robin Hood is now out of a Medusa range. Ice
Hmm.
Block would require one more for certain cards because it's not just
Yep.
Challenger, it's there for the benefit, and that also just gives you Ling a much more important role than Phil would do.
Yeah.
Phil gives you Challenger, and then it does the thing when you play a hero, but we don't really mind too much about that. And but as you say, it also goes into that. It's like it's another utility card in that 3 drop slot, and you have to sort of find where um, you how much you want in the ratios. And I think two Ling is very very good as well. And I think again, if anyone wants tips for the mirror because their local is all playing Kiwi birds, I think Ling is also pretty good for the mirror.
Yeah.
Your Calhoun can now take out an Alice and stuff like that. It's really good, I think.
Yep.
Mm.
And as the last couple of versions have shown, we sort of ended up, took those lessons we learned, right? We ended up on fully an inkable removal suite. People have asked me about Baboom, like why Baboom, right?
Mm.
And I think that's a great question to ask when you're trying to understand the deck. You need some amount of removal, in my opinion, in this deck. You need some Diablo answers. You need shift line answers. You need little Cindy answers. Sometimes you just need to answer a Flynn,
Mm.
stuff like that. It's not really optimal in a red purple matchup to be answering Flynn in that way. Most of the time, you just want to play your own characters, but sometimes you need to have an answer like that. And then the strength, I guess we didn't talk too much about the strength, but the idea of like having a utility 3 drop when we're on the draw, and then throwing down like singing a strength the following turn,
Mm.
is one of the prime ways that this deck is able to um, take back tempo
Mm.
when we go second.
Yeah.
And so that can be very important.
Well, it was really interesting. Both those cards, like, so for the boom, it went from fire the cannons to twin fire to the boom, and it was that interesting thing of, yeah, there are some cards in the game. If I don't answer this Robin Hood shift line, I lose. There's no point of me playing characters if they have a Cinderella that can sing strength, so I have to take that out.
Yep.
Merfolk Banzai was for like twin fire and stuff like that. Sometimes if Diablo if there's two Diablos, you have to get rid of one. So we went to this point where we needed these cards, and now it's gone down to it's only I really play this card if I'm going to lose if I don't answer something. Otherwise, it's
Yep.
ink. So we've gone with a boom, and it's just been good. And sometimes chip damage is great. If they run a Maui into a Smee, you can be like, and I'll just finish it off and keep turning sideways. And
Yeah.
as well as strength, that's a really interesting point because we were playing Smash for a long time, and it was like, again, Ursula's aerials. There were certain cards that I just had to play Smash on to remove them. Even a Calhoun that would trade my Calhoun. But then it's like, hold on, how do we do this more efficiently? And it was setting up
Right.
these stall like 3 drops, like John Silver, Pete as well. I think is pretty good for it because then they generally can't answer your board as long as you don't turn sideways that turn, and then
Yep.
you can get to sing strength to remove their character. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see the deck. It was really nice to see it like through each stage as well, like where you've got to with it.
Yeah. So this is a lot of fun. The I'll just show off a
Oh,
test.
Yeah.
real quick here. So
Bonus
this is
list.
one thing that we're testing. Just going forward while we're screwing around having fun. Someone had posted a list that Decandio had made. I apologize to him if it was not public, but I wasn't the one that posted it. So
Gonna get my channel
he
shut
had
down.
Oh no. So he had been, I don't know how seriously he had been testing Jafar. This is a card that a lot of players sort of looked at and like zero strength, yeah, bad into red, and that is 100% true. But there's definitely some interesting things that you can do with a card like this. Will he make the actual list that I take to a store champ? Probably not.
Hmm.
But he's got some interesting things there. Um, and so I wanted to show like testing a card like that off just to like point out to people like the best deck builders in the game. And I don't know that I consider myself amongst them, but like if you just pick up a deck from DeCandio, right, and he's testing Jafar, that sort of tells you like, yeah, all these cards that exist in the game, um, whether you think it's good or not, like Mr. Arrow, all these cards might be good, right? And until you actually play them,
Hmm.
maybe it's worth testing it. Maybe it's worth trying. Uh, I would have never known that the kit shift line was way worse than I thought it was going to be if I hadn't actually tested it. Um,
And
so
and
just,
just at least once or twice during the set, we'll try and make Sisu Water Dragon work. Um, and
yeah.
when I see it in a list, I know it's because of his love for the card. Yeah.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
thank you very much for doing a video with me, man. It was really nice. I had a really lot of fun chatting with you again. Any shout outs at all? Anything you want to mention before we end it?
Shout outs to you and Bad Vegas in particular. Everybody in our testing group that helped us figure out that like, hey, this is in fact a real deck. This is not just us goofing around.
Mm.
Like there is something here to it. There was a lot of support given from everyone there,
Yeah,
so it
big
was
thank
it
you
was
to
quite lovely.
everyone we test with when they're like, we want to get testing for Continentals, and we're like, cool, play this one-off um, BS deck that no one else is playing, and you'll probably never see in the event. Um, and please let
Yep.
us practice. So very grateful for that. That was really awesome of you
Yeah.
guys. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, lovely to have you, man. It's lovely to catch up as well. And thanks everyone for watching. I think this is some really good listen.